The town of Alder Ridge sat quietly between two mountains that most maps barely acknowledged. Pine forests climbed the slopes like dark waves frozen in place, and a single highway curved along the valley floor before disappearing into rock. Tourists passed through in summer. In winter, the snow decided who stayed. Cell service flickered even on clear days. Power lines stretched across unstable ground that had shifted for decades, though no one talked about that. The mountain had a history, but history is easy to ignore when nothing has happened recently. Elias Warren never ignored history. He taught electronics at the local high school, a small brick building with cracked steps and a gymnasium that echoed even when empty. Students liked him well enough. He spoke softly, never rushed, and never raised his voice. When others debated loudly, he listened. When others guessed, he calculated. Most people in Alder Ridge described him the same way. Smart, but strange. He lived alone on the north edge of town where the trees began to thicken. His house wasn't large, but it was reinforced in ways that looked unnecessary. The foundation had been inspected twice. The roof beams were doubled. A generator sat under a weatherproof enclosure. On the side yard, a tall steel lattice structure began rising into the sky. At first, no one paid attention. Then it grew taller, 40 feet, then 60. By the time the antenna array was mounted at the top, it was impossible to ignore. People slowed their trucks as they drove past. Some laughed. Some shook their heads. A radio tower. In a town with internet, smartphones, and satellite dishes. At the diner, conversation started. You building a spaceship, Elias? Planning for the apocalypse. You know we have Wi-Fi now, right? He smiled politely and stirred his coffee. He never argued. But months earlier, during a quiet town council meeting attended by barely 12 people, he had stood up and presented something different. Satellite elevation data, historical rainfall shifts, soil saturation charts, aerial scans from public geological archives. The north slope above Alder Ridge had been slowly destabilizing for years. Tree root systems were thinning after repeated dry seasons. Microcracks in the upper rock face had expanded. The models weren't dramatic. They were precise. If the right storm hit at the right time, the slope wouldn't just slide. It would collapse. He explained how a large landslide would take the highway first, then the power lines, then the cell towers along the ridge. Not because they were poorly built, but because they all shared the same vulnerable corridor. The room had been quiet. Then someone laughed. We've had storms for 100 years. Another man leaned back in his chair. You predicting the end of the world, Elias? The council chair thanked him for the presentation, said they would look into it. The folder he handed over was later placed in a cabinet that no one reopened. Elias didn't argue after that. He simply began building. The tower wasn't decorative. It was part of a private VHF and UHF relay system with backup power, battery banks, and a directional long-range antenna pointed toward the next county's emergency repeater network. He installed a weather station, soil moisture sensors, a seismograph unit small enough to fit inside a toolbox. At night, his house glowed faintly from equipment lights, oscilloscopes, frequency monitors, charging systems cycling quietly. People drove by and shook their heads. He wasn't preparing for fantasy. He was preparing for silence. Summer passed. Autumn brought dry winds. The mountain remained still, as it always had. Then in late October, the rain came. Not heavy at first, just steady, relentless. 3 days, then 5. The soil above town began to drink more than it could hold. Elias stood outside in a rain jacket, watching the slope through binoculars. He had already reinforced his backup systems. Fuel reserves were topped off, batteries fully charged. Inside his home, his monitoring equipment showed something new. Micro-movements, tiny shifts in ground vibration, the kind most people would never notice. He did not sleep that night. At 2:17 a.m., a deep sound rolled across the valley. Not thunder, something heavier. Windows trembled. Dogs began barking in different parts of town. A car alarm went off briefly, then stopped. Then came a second sound, longer, like a mountain inhaling. Elias looked at his vibration readings. The spikes were no longer subtle. He stepped outside into cold rain and stared toward the dark outline of the north slope. The ground beneath his boots vibrated once more. And then the mountain moved. The roar was beyond storm, beyond wind. It was rock breaking from itself, trees snapping like matchsticks, earth folding downward in unstoppable motion. Power lines flashed once in bright blue arcs. Then everything went black. The town lights vanished. The cell towers went silent. The highway disappeared under thousands of tons of rock and mud. And Alder Ridge was cut off from the world. In the darkness, only one structure still had power. A tall steel tower on the north edge of town. Inside his house, Elias reached for his radio handset as the first emergency sirens failed mid-wail. He pressed the transmit key and waited to see if anyone could hear him. Static filled the room for half a second. Then a faint voice broke through. County emergency, signal weak, identify. Elias adjusted the gain and repositioned the directional antenna by a few degrees. Rain hammered against the roof, but inside, his systems hummed steadily. This is Alder Ridge, he said calmly. Primary access routes are likely destroyed. Power and cellular networks down. I have independent relay capability. Do you copy? There was a pause. Crackling. Then clearer this time. We copy. Repeat. Alder Ridge is transmitting. Yes. Silence again, but this time it felt different. Measured. Alert. Stand by. Elias didn't move. He watched the voltage levels on his battery bank, the signal strength meter, the secondary frequency backup. He had expected interference. He had planned for it. Minutes later, a more stable voice came through. Alder Ridge, this is county operations. We lost all telemetry from your sector. We assume total outage. It is, Elias replied. Except for me. Outside, the town was waking in confusion. Doors opened. Flashlights flickered through windows. Engines turned over and stalled. The distant wail of a siren died again as the emergency system failed without grid power. Mud had already swallowed part of Main Street. The northern road was gone entirely, replaced by a wall of debris that rose higher than a house. The cell towers along the ridge lay twisted under rock. People tried their phones. No signal. They tried landlines. Dead. Some attempted to drive out, only to find the highway buried beneath earth that still shifted and groaned. By dawn, panic began to spread. The grocery store manager stood outside his building, staring at the collapsed overpass in the distance. The gas station pumps were useless without electricity. The small medical clinic had backup power for 6 hours at most. And the rain had not stopped. At 7:42 a.m., the town police chief, Daniel Harper, knocked on Elias's door. He didn't look amused anymore. You got power? Harper asked. Yes. You got communication? Yes. Harper hesitated, rain dripping from his jacket. The mocking tone from months ago was gone. Can you reach the county? I already have. Inside the house, Harper stood in front of equipment he had once called a hobby. Now the room looked less eccentric and more like a command center. Radios stacked with labeled frequencies. Charging stations. Weather monitors. A printed evacuation grid of the valley pinned to the wall. Harper listened as Elias relayed casualty estimates to county operations. 2 injured from falling debris. 1 missing vehicle last seen near the North Road before collapse. Flood risk increasing near the river bend. The county confirmed what Elias already suspected. Rescue teams were assembling, but heavy equipment couldn't reach them until the slide stabilized. Helicopters might attempt approach if weather permitted. But not today. Alder Ridge was on its own. Word spread quickly. By noon, people began gathering outside Elias's property. Not to laugh this time. To ask, can you call my sister in the next town? Can you check if the hospital knows we're cut off? Can you tell them we need insulin? He did not refuse anyone. Instead, he established structure. 1 frequency for emergency coordination. 1 for medical relay. 1 for outbound civilian messages. He assigned volunteers to manage written requests. He turned his garage into a temporary communication hub. The tall steel tower that once symbolized paranoia now stood as the only link to civilization. The rain intensified again in the afternoon. Water began pooling in low areas. Without drainage crews and power pumps, the risk of secondary flooding increased. The slope above town was still unstable. Aftershocks of falling debris echoed intermittently. County operations transmitted a grim update at 4:13 p.m. A second section of hillside showed signs of imminent failure. If it collapsed, it would send a new wave of debris toward the western edge of Alder Ridge, toward the elementary school shelter where dozens had gathered. Elias looked at his printed topographical map. He had studied these gradients months ago. He knew the likely path of flow if the upper fracture line gave way. He keyed the mic, You need to move the shelter. Harper looked at him sharply. Move where? The old quarry road. It sits 10 feet higher and has natural rock shielding. The mud won't crest that elevation. That road's half blocked. It's still passable on foot. You have 30 minutes at most. Harper hesitated. Outside, thunder rolled. Or maybe it wasn't thunder. Elias didn't raise his voice. If I'm wrong, you waste 20 minutes. If I'm right, you save 40 lives. Harper stared at the map. Then he grabbed his radio. All across town, people began moving again. Rain soaked through jackets. Parents carried children. Volunteers guided the elderly. The elementary school shelter emptied under darkening skies. At 4:41 p.m., the mountain cracked again. This time the sound was closer. A second wave of earth broke loose, surging down the western channel exactly as Elias had predicted. Mud and rocks swallowed the lower shelter building less than 10 minutes after it was vacated. The town watched from higher ground in stunned silence as debris covered the place they had just stood. No one laughed now. Back inside his house, Elias adjusted his antenna alignment again. The weather interference was worsening. Signal clarity was dropping. Then something unexpected happened. His main transmitter flickered. Voltage dipped. He checked the battery monitor. One bank was failing. Water intrusion in an external conduit. If the system lost redundancy, his signal range would shrink by half. And county operations had just informed him that air rescue was postponed until morning due to wind shear, which meant Alder Ridge would face another full night isolated, with unstable ground, and one weakening communication lifeline. Elias opened the equipment panel and stared at the failing circuit. If this went down, the mountain wouldn't just be silent. It would swallow their last voice. The voltage dipped again. A warning light blinked red across the lower battery array. Rainwater had seeped through a conduit junction that had been secure for years. The landslide's vibration must have loosened it. Elias shut off the secondary load to preserve core transmission. The room dimmed slightly as non-essential systems powered down. Outside, the wind intensified. The second landslide had changed the valley's airflow, creating unpredictable gusts that struck the tower in irregular bursts. The steel structure groaned, but it held. County operations called in. Alder Ridge, your signal strength is fluctuating. I'm aware, Elias replied evenly. Working on stabilization. He pulled on gloves and stepped outside into cold rain. Mud soaked through his boots as he crossed the yard toward the tower's power junction housing. The sky was nearly black, though it was only early evening. Flashlights moved in the distance where townspeople gathered along the quarry road. The temporary shelter was holding. For now. He opened the external panel. Water had seeped into the conduit line, feeding the secondary battery bank. Not catastrophic, but enough to short the redundancy. If the primary bank failed overnight, the entire relay would drop. He could not allow that. Elias returned inside and began rewiring the load distribution manually. He bypassed the damaged conduit and rerouted power through a protected interior channel he had installed months ago as a contingency. When the council had ignored him, when neighbors had laughed, he had still prepared for this exact moment. The process was delicate. One miscalculation could overload the inverter. He recalibrated the charge controller, redistributed the battery draw, and reduced output wattage to essential frequencies only. Signal strength stabilized. Not perfect, but steady. At 9:12 p.m., county operations confirmed helicopter deployment at first light, weather permitting. Heavy excavation teams were mobilizing from 2 directions. Estimated ground access, 18 to 24 hours. Alder Ridge would survive the night. But the town did not sleep. People gathered near Elias's home, not intruding, just staying close. The steel tower had become something else now. It wasn't a curiosity. It was reassurance. Parents approached him quietly. Can you tell my brother we're safe? He transmitted each message. Measured, clear, controlled, short, efficient bursts across the valley and beyond. At 2:03 a.m., the mountain rumbled again, but this time it was minor. Debris settling. The slope was losing energy. By dawn, the rain finally stopped. Fog rose from the valley floor, revealing the scale of destruction. The highway was buried beneath a brown scar that cut through the forest. Power poles lay snapped like twigs. The cell tower on the ridge was twisted and half submerged. But the steel lattice in Elias's yard stood upright, catching the first light of morning. At 6:47 a.m., The distant thudding of rotor blades echoed through the valley. People stepped out from the quarry road shelter and looked up. A rescue helicopter emerged through thinning fog, guided not by cell signals, not by town infrastructure, but by coordinates transmitted through a private relay system built by one quiet teacher. The first medical evacuations began. By midday, heavy equipment crews were carving a temporary access path through the debris. State emergency officials arrived and immediately requested a briefing. They met Elias inside his home. They studied his monitoring logs, his geological projections, his communication architecture. One official asked him a simple question. When did you know this would happen? He did not dramatize his answer. I didn't know, he said. I calculated the probability. News crews arrived 2 days later once access was restored. Cameras focused on the damage, the destroyed highway, the collapsed shelter building. But eventually they turned toward the tower. The same tower that had once been a joke. The town council publicly acknowledged his early warnings. The folder from months ago was pulled from the cabinet and reopened. Funding was approved for a permanent municipal emergency relay network based on his design. Soil stabilization studies began immediately, but the moment that mattered most did not happen in front of cameras. It happened one evening a week later. The power grid had been partially restored. Temporary cell service returned. Life was slowly rebuilding. Elias stood outside at dusk, checking alignment on the antenna array. A pickup truck stopped near his driveway. Daniel Harper stepped out. He didn't speak right away. He just looked at the tower. I should have listened, Harper said finally. Elias adjusted the final bolt and stepped back. It's not about being right, he replied. It's about being ready. The mountains stood quiet again, as if nothing had happened. But Alder Ridge had changed. They no longer laughed at preparation. They no longer dismissed quiet intelligence. Because when the mountain cut them off from the world, the only voice that remained was the one they had almost ignored. And sometimes survival doesn't belong to the loudest person in the room. It belongs to the one who prepared in silence.